Hey everyone, welcome to week 4. Last week we got a taste of studying the Bible using the verse mapping technique. Now over the next few weeks, we're going to focus on doing an inductive study of the Bible. The inductive study involves collecting information and then drawing conclusions based on that information. It's when we get to know the details of a particular part of the Bible, then we look at those details and it helps paint the picture of its greater meaning. There are 3 steps: observation, interpretation, and application. Observation is collecting information about the background of the text and what the text says. Interpretation is the process of finding what that text means, and then application is putting what we've learned into practice in our lives. As we mentioned in the first week of our study, we often jump right to application. We like to ask the question, what does the Bible mean for me? Before we ask, what did the Bible mean to the author and the original audience? But we often end up applying the wrong lessons in our lives when we don't take the time to truly understand what God is trying to teach us in the Bible. So this week, we'll dive into step 1 of inductive study, observation. When we do a little background research in our study of the Bible, we're preparing ourselves to develop a more accurate picture of the meaning of the passage. A good starting point is the 5 W and 1 H questions we answered last week: who, what, where, when, why, and how. We're going to use Philippians as an example a lot during the course of this study, so if you have your Bible ready, go ahead and flip open to Philippians chapter 1. You can even pause this video if you need time to get there. Remember, we're using the NIV translation, but you can use whatever translation you've picked for this study. So let's start with the who. Who is involved in the passage? In Philippians, who is speaking and who's the author of the book? In some cases, the answer to those 2 questions might be different. For example, a doctor named Luke wrote the book of Luke, but in many passages, Jesus is speaking, which makes sense since it's a biography. In the case of Philippians, it's a letter. You might even hear it called an epistle. And in letters, usually the person speaking and the author are the same person. But how do we know who the author is? Well, a good study Bible will have this type of introductory info at the beginning of each book. It usually includes a timeline showing key dates and events, vital statistics, facts about the books like the date it was written, an overview, a summary of the book, keywords, commonly used words and concepts, themes, the primary topics covered throughout the book, and a map showing the key places found in the book and retelling the story from a geographical perspective. In addition to the introductory information about the whole book, there are study notes at the bottom of each page under the verses that have more specific information about each passage. But in this case, identifying the speaker and author is easy. It doesn't really require a study Bible. Let's open our Bibles to the first chapter of Philippians. It starts, Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all God's holy people in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. It's pretty clear who is speaking and who the authors are. It's Paul and Timothy. It's actually easy to figure this out for all of Paul's letters. This kind of greeting is found in all 13 of his letters that we have in the Bible. The passage also tells us who they're talking to. It's the early church in the city of Philippi. Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter who the author is and who they're writing to? Well, when it comes to better understanding the Bible, one principle is especially true, and that's context is king. If we pull a verse or a chapter out of its context, we risk misinterpreting the passage. Think about it like this. Imagine it was your job to explain the Super Bowl to someone who lives in a different country. You would have to customize your explanation to their understanding. So when you tell them that the Chiefs were playing in the Super Bowl, you might first have to show them where Kansas City is on a map. Or if you told them that the winner of American Idol sang the national anthem before the game started, you might also have to explain what that TV show is and play them a clip of the Star Spangled Banner. None of that makes sense within their context. Their context informs their understanding. Some parts of the Bible were written by a specific person directly to a specific group of people. For instance, Paul and Timothy expressly writing to Philippians, people from Philippi. So what they wrote in that letter made sense to the Philippians because it was within their context and it was relevant to their lives. So how do we get a hold of all this vital information? In most Bibles, you'll see references to other passages beside or below the text. These are called cross-references, and they're to point you to other parts of the Bible that are related. When you start using these cross-references, you'll come to realize how interconnected the different parts of the Bible really are. It's truly amazing how a book that was written by multiple authors across multiple countries and multiple centuries has so many threads that run throughout the whole Bible. So when you read Philippians 1:1, you'll likely see a cross-reference to Acts 16. That tells us that Acts 16 is somehow related to Philippians. So let's take a look at it, starting with verse 1. It says, Paul went to Derbe and then to Lystra, where there was a young disciple named Timothy. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey. So here we learn a little bit about the relationship between Paul and Timothy. It shows us in the book of Acts that Paul met Timothy when he was a young man. Timothy grew up in a household where one parent believed and another did not. Then Paul invited Timothy to join him in his ministry. Paul and Timothy are somewhat of a ministry tag team. Then if you jump down to Acts 16:12, you'll read, from there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony in the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. So now we see that Paul was traveling around spreading the good news about Jesus, runs into Timothy, takes him on this journey where they end up in the city of Philippi, which is the leading city of its region. Now I'm going to pause for a minute, and I'd love for you to have one or two people in your group read Acts 16, verses 12 through 40. It's going to recount the story of how the church in Philippi got started, and then we'll come back. Now that's a crazy story, right? I mean, Paul, Timothy, and a few others show up. Meet a wealthy woman named Lydia who becomes one of the first followers of Jesus there. Then Paul cast a demon out of a woman who is a slave and a fortune teller. The woman's owner has Paul and Timothy and their companions thrown in jail. God miraculously frees them, and the jailer and his family decide to follow Jesus. That is the beginning of an incredible church. And when you understand who the authors are and their shared history with the audience and the audience's context, it helps you better understand the content. Next, we ask the what question, which we actually already answered. It's a letter, which is clear from the first couple verses and the introductory material in the study Bible. Then the when and where questions, those aren't answered in the book of Philippians itself. So once again, we turn to the introductory material in a study Bible, which tells us that it was written in 61 AD from Rome while Paul was under house arrest. So it's been about 10 years since they started the church. Then there's the why question. Why did Paul and Timothy write to the church in Philippi? Again, the introduction in your study Bible will tell you this, but it also becomes clear as you read through the book. As we read chapter 1, it's clear that Paul and Timothy wanted to update the church on Paul's imprisonment and thank them for their support. Then we read in chapter 2 something else that likely prompted the writing of this letter. Starting in verse 25, it reads, "But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, almost died. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare my sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. Welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honor men like him because he almost died for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for the help you could not give me. See, the Philippian church had sent Epaphroditus to help care for Paul, but Epaphroditus got sick. When he recovered, Paul decided to send him back to Philippi and asked that the church welcome him warmly. As we read through Philippians, we get the sense that it is a letter to dear friends. Paul is sharing news and bearing his soul. Paul was distressed that Epaphroditus almost died and knew the Philippians would have been worried. Paul updated them on his imprisonment and his plans and thanked them for their generous support. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, that's cool for the Philippians and their buddy, but what does that have to do with me? It's helpful to think about it like this. While the Bible was not written to us, it was still written for us. Even though Paul and Timothy were writing about something that happened thousands of years ago in a totally different part of the world, there are still things for us to learn. As we read Philippians, we see this consistent theme of finding joy in all circumstances. Philippians is a book of encouragement. Paul is writing to encourage them to remain steady in the faith and in the joy of the gospel. This is clear from Paul's own response to his own hardships. He's writing this from jail, but instead of being down and despondent, he chose to give thanks, be content, and rely on God's strength. Paul advises the Philippians to take this same approach to trials that he is taking, urging them to stand firm together for the gospel. And then the final question we have to ask is the how question. How is more relevant for some books than others? We mentioned the book of Luke earlier. The how question is important for that book because Luke wasn't actually with Jesus. So how was he able to write a biography of Jesus? Well, he was an educated man and did diligent research. In the case of Philippians, the how question is that Paul wrote a letter with Timothy's help, and Epaphroditus most likely brought it back to Philippi with him. So that's the background: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. We've got the basics down for the book, but as we dive into individual passages, we want to keep exploring. There are certain literary devices used by authors that tend to indicate when something is important. So when you're reading, look out for lists. Anytime you see a list of things, write them out as bullet points. Or you can look for contrasts and comparisons. As you make a list, notice when the author pits two things against one another. Contrasts compare opposite things like good and bad. Comparisons highlight similarities by using the words like and as. A good example of contrast is in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:43 through 44, when Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Then you can also look out for terms of conclusion, words like therefore, thus, so that, and for this reason. Those are all called terms of conclusion. You can look out for repeated concepts. Notice recurring words or ideas. These direct us toward the author's main idea. For example, when you read Philippians 1, we see words like joy, rejoice, and thank several times. This pattern continues throughout the book. Joy is one of the key themes of Philippians. Be on the lookout for commands. Is there anything the readers or the audience are being told to do? What about timing? If there's a comment about how much time has passed, make a note of it. And finally, be on the lookout for geographic locations. Pay attention to the setting and locations that are mentioned. Remember, at the beginning of our time, we use the word inductive. That's when we collect as much information as we can, look at a passage from as many different angles, and then with that information, we come to a conclusion about what the passage means. So we learned that Paul and Timothy were intimately connected to the Philippians and helped start the church there. Love these people, and these people loved their friend Epaphroditus. Even though Paul was suffering in jail at the time of the writing, he was able to encourage the church to be faithful in the midst of difficult circumstances. Having all that context makes the teaching and commands much more vivid and alive. While it wasn't originally written to us, it still has a lot to say to us. The Bible still speaks thousands of years later into our lives and transforms us from the inside out. These skills and study habits will help us dig even deeper into the beauty and transformation the Bible provides.
So I've incorporated the Bible study books that actually help me with the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And it really is so helpful to just understand the background, because every book has a story and like a background that it's placed in, the time period, the people, like what's going on with their relationship with God during that time. And it's just been so helpful to actually understand what they're trying to convey, and also just learn so much more about God in those times. And it's really helped me just put it toward my own life and be able to make that transformation, or even just see God, like learn more about God and who He is.
Yes. Yeah. I always do that, especially when so a few years ago when I started helping out with small groups there, from time to time I would get opportunities to be the one to speak about certain Bible passage or verse that we were going through as a group at that time. And so I started getting into looking for specific sermons and looking for specific sermons and resource tools, specifically talking about those chapters in the Bible, and not just those chapters in the Bible, but what was going around the historical time, just to have a context of what was going on around that time. So yeah, I lead into like historical books to learn more about the historical context about the time, and that really helped me understand more about what the Bible is saying. For example, like when they're talking about kneading dough, understanding that was the meals of those times. You know what I mean? I'm trying to think of a good example, but something like that.
What have I learned about God from reading the Bible? Everything. I'm one of those guys who doesn't just believe in God or something about God because somebody tells me. I need something more than that. So at one point in my life, I realized if somebody gave me an endowment to go fly around the world and prove that there was a God, I would use that money to go to every country I could find and ask, what are your encounters with God? Did anybody record anything? I would collect those writings from every culture as deep as I could go from everywhere. And I'd go back and I'd look for connections. Are they encountering the same God? What are the commonalities? And I realized one day that that's exactly what the Bible is. We've got writings from a 2,000-year period of time in 3 different languages from 3 continents, and they're all encountering the same God. And you can hyperlink these texts one with another, and you see that this is the same being. And so when I think about what have I learned about God from the Bible, everything.